Okay, we're going to look at the Compendium of Theology, certain chapters on predicates of God, and start with chapter 4, 4 through 15, 28 to 35. As I say, I'm not going to go through each one of these, but I like to talk about them in general a little bit and ask some questions. So we get the proof of God's existence, the one that's analogous to the one in the Summa, in chapter 3. And he uses the proof from motion alone. And so for St. Thomas, that's one way, and I guess it's the most fundamental. An interesting question is the relation of the five ways to each other. Does the first way, in a sense, include all the others? Do you have to begin with the first way? Are they all autonomous and independent of each other? St. Thomas obviously thinks the first way here is most fundamental. That's why he uses it in the compendium. But now we move on to the attributes of God. So because God exists as a first mover, we then derive from that, and perhaps from other metaphysical and empirical evidence, and that's an interesting question to ask. This was in the discussion box. Where do all these attributes, in a sense, come from? Are they all included in the notion of the first mover, and we just sort of like unfold it in our thinking through discursive reasoning? And through syllogism, or do we have to add more information that we get from our senses and even from metaphysical principles, in a sense, to derive these attributes? God is immovable. Okay, if he's the first mover, obviously, and not moved, then he's immovable. If he were moved, he would have to be moved either by himself or by another. St. Thomas's principle is nothing can move itself, nothing can cause itself. So therefore, he would have to be moved by another, but then he wouldn't be the first mover. So you could see the connection there with being a first mover and then being immovable, immobilem. Okay. St. Thomas gives some other arguments about why something can't move itself in the second paragraph, and but we'll just move on. So the next short chapter, chapter 5, God is eternal. Well, everything that be or begins to be is affected through motion or change. Okay? So if you begin to be or end, okay, it has to be through a change or a motion. But God is immobile. So therefore he cannot begin to be or end to be. Done. He's eternal. Okay. Chapter 6, God's existence is necessary. This is actually the third way in the Summa. Why would God's existence be necessary? Well, that if he was not necessary, then it would be possible for him not to exist. But God is immutable, and therefore it's impossible for God to be and not to be. Okay, but possibility means you have the possibility of being or not being. In other words, a possible being is a changeable being, and God is unchangeable. Therefore, he's necessary. Okay. And another argument, if it has a possibility of being and not being, then it would need something else to make it be. That thing would have to be prior to make it be, but there's nothing prior to a first cause. So there you go. So it does seem in these chapters that it's all stemming from God's existence as a first mover. His first mover, he's incorruptible. He's immovable. He's immovable, he's eternal, he's necessary. Now we have not eternal, meaning outside of time here, but that he is never ending. He exists always. Est semper. And of course, this does derive directly from the last one. Whatever necessarily exists, always exists. Omne enim quod necessa est, esse semper est. If it necessarily exists, it must always exist, because if it didn't always exist, then there was a time where it didn't exist when it didn't exist, but then it wouldn't be necessary being, because something else had to bring it to existence and all that. Okay. It has to be never without existence once you accept it as necessary. Okay. Here's St. Thomas's, anti-Hawking and Krauss statement here in the third paragraph. Nothing brings itself forth from potency to act or from non-being to being, right? Something else has to do that. Okay. So now we have a little bit more obscure quality. There's no succession in God. Okay. So his existence is not only eternal and never-ending, but it's simultaneous. He exists all at once. Okay, he doesn't exist this moment, then that moment, and that moment, the way we exist. God sends us each moment incrementally, and we receive it in time. God has all the moments of his existence all at once, and that's, of course, impossible for us to imagine. But we're going to participate in that simultaneous existence to some extent in heaven, we're told. And if you don't have simultaneous existence, then you don't have everything. You don't have all the moments of your existence. That means something can come to you which wasn't already there, right? But that's a kind of change. So since God is unchangeable, he can't sort of receive one moment and then another, because that's in a sense him changing. Okay, so you see, I do think we see that these chapters, these attributes, all do sort of derive from each other, succession back to the first. Chapter 9, God is simple. Again, we can go through all these. God is his own essence. Now, these get more difficult metaphysically, I think, to understand. God is simple is pretty clear. If he were more than one thing, he would have two factors. One has to be in potency, the other in act. There's no potency in God, therefore he can't be made of parts. Okay. But what about God is his own essence? This is tricky. He's simple. Okay. So if he were different from his essence, if there was existence and essence, there's two components. I think it's pretty simple there. There can't be two factors in God. But when I say complex, this is really impossible to understand and imagine, literally. What it would be like to have a purely simple being whose existence is the same as its essence, whose essence, in fact, is existence itself. Okay. I'll just read a little bit here. Whenever an essence is not absolutely identical with the thing of which it is the essence, something is discerned in that thing which has the function of potency, and something with act. So again, if you think about all these attributes really have to do with the nature of being first act. If all you have is act, no potency, you don't change, you don't receive time in succession, you don't have any possibility of not existing, right? You have simplicity, you can't change, and you have to be perfectly simple, which means that you have to be your own essence. Next chapter, St. Thomas argues that this essence is nothing other than God's existence. And then we have a few other chapters. But I just wanted to go through a few of those, and hopefully we can explore more of these in the discussions. And we'll go to the next set of chapters in the next lecture.